All right, this is another lecture in Texas history. Again, Nathan Giesenschlag here. And this Texas history lecture covers our ongoing pursuit of geography in Texas, and we're passing through now the Brazos River Valley. In the previous lecture, I kind of talked about how cotton had been such a cash crop to Texas in the late 19th and early 20th century, and that you could really see how much a town had made and how prosperous a community was in that era, late 19th, say from 1880 to about 1940 territory, how prosperous they were and how much money was made on the backs of cotton, and that by extension sharecroppers and tenant farmers, white and black alike, and small-time farmers who were not either. But the fact of the matter is there was money to be made in cotton, and some people made a lot of money, and some people made a living, and some people didn't ever get ahead. But anyways, when we talk about Central Texas and we talk about cotton, it's fair to remember the city of Waco. And so most of you watching this are familiar with Waco in the fact that it is a Central Texas city that is, in more recent times, very recent times, has been associated with Chip and Joanna Gaines of Magnolia Farm and Magnolia this, that, or the other, fixer-upper, and so on and so forth. And in some respects, at least in the last 5 years, and as I keep saying, I'm recording these videos in 2020, the year of all years, probably the year we'll never forget. But in 5 years ago, believe it or not, Waco in a sense became hip, and perhaps some of you and cosmopolitan maybe. Some of you might have grandparents or parents who made pilgrimages almost to Waco to go eat at Chip and Joanna's Elite Cafe table there on the Circle on Highway 77 just outside I-35. But whatever the case may be, that wasn't the case for Waco for nearly a century, it seemed like. First, the Great Depression and the collapse of cotton, and then also that tornado that I referenced in a previous lecture wrecked Waco, and Waco was in a sense never the same again, at least until the early 21st century. Well, anyhow, when we talk about Waco, let's go back into the past and give you an idea how much Waco was supposed to be, or it was thought by many people to be, the next great city of Texas. As I keep reiterating, two things that is generally in a Texas history class or just as a person living and looking into the past and looking into the future is that while they say hindsight is 20/20, and that's pretty much true, I think it's also fair to say that history is not a photograph. Like if you're watching me right now, you can see that I have a bit of a 5 o'clock shadow, but I haven't, obviously, if you can kind of see, I haven't shaved in about a day. You can also see that I've got a light blue shirt on. You can see in the background an organ and a piano, and books are strewn everywhere. But history probably is better described as, people say it's 20/20 or hindsight is 20/20. It's not. It's better described as a portrait that has been painted. Historians oftentimes pick a subject and to lay aside the hacks and the cons and the real ideologues who are pushing a particular agenda. Historians are not objective in a strict sense, like just weighing the facts like a balance. I mean, we're human beings, but generally speaking, you do follow where your sources take you. Okay, so you came in with a preconceived notion about this person or that event, and if it's confirmed, it's confirmed. If it's not, it's not. But you write the story, you write the history, and it tells it in a certain way. But back to the larger point, we look into the past, and we have to be careful, and I perhaps beat a dead horse here, but we have to be a little bit humble or a bit patient with our ancestors when we say, well, why didn't they know this? Why didn't they understand that? And maybe it was because of their limitations of knowledge. Maybe it's because of their limitations of mindset and mentality, stubbornness, or something else. I don't know. Maybe it's just culture. It could be a host of factors. The fact is that when we look into the past, we have to remember that our ancestors, like ourselves, and I've said this too as well to you, do not have foresight. We have prognostications, we have expectations, we think this will happen, it might happen, and so on. But to say with a certainty that this will be the future, they don't. And so in the 19th century, and even into the early 20th century, when cotton was still king in Texas as the cash crop of the state and the moneymaker for the most part, with a few exceptions at Galveston, many folks thought that Waco would be the great interior city of Texas. And even in the 1870s, going back a generation, even in the 1870s, you will see Waco talked about as that next great city, the great interior city. In about 1876 or so, 1878, right around there, the state of Texas will hold a referendum on the basic question of where are we going to put the capital of Texas. If you did not know this, the capital of Texas has moved around several times in our history. The fact is that when it has moved, it's been at Columbia, just outside of down in Brazos County. It's been in Houston. It's been obviously in Austin and other places. But it's moved around in our history. So even in just the period of the Republic of Texas, it moved around. And after the Civil War, it was obvious that Texas would grow. We knew that. Maybe we didn't realize it would be 29 million strong or whatever the exact number is right at this moment. But the fact is that it would grow, and do we need to move the capital around? And so on that referendum was, where shall we have the state of Texas? Where shall be the capital be? Shall it stay in Austin? Shall we move it to Houston? And it should tell you that Houston, though Galveston sneered at it and called it Mudville, Houston had enough pull to be able to get its name on that ballot. Or in 3, would it be at Waco? Well, anyways, obviously Austin won. It stayed at Austin and has been there ever since the Republic of Texas days, when they changed the name of Waterloo, Texas, or the community of Waterloo, to that of Austin. But if you got your name on the ballot to be the next home of the capital of your state, you were somebody in something. So that ought to indicate to you what type of thinking was with Waco. Waco had railroads going through it. Again, in the 19th century, it's a very different story for them than it is for us. And so when we talk about railroads went in and out north and south, east, west of Waco. And so railroads were the lifeblood. They were the interstate highways of the 19th and early 20th century before the explosion of the automobile in the teens in the 1920s, especially the 20s. And then especially, obviously, the building of the federal highway system and later still the interstate highway system. But anyways, railroads all passed through there. Now you may say, did they have steamboats on the Brazos? The answer is, frankly, to that point, no. There's, to my knowledge, only one recorded event in the history of the Brazos River of a steamboat, and it was a small one, making it all the way up from the Gulf of Mexico at Freeport, Velasco, all the way to Waco, Texas. Because there are a series of falls and series of natural barriers on the river itself, one just outside of Washington on the Brazos, and then 2 at Marlin, or right outside of the city of Marlin, hence the name Falls County, Texas, because of those falls. You can't get a boat past it, basically. And you couldn't dynamite them out of the way anyways to any effect. All of which is to say is that Waco is really dependent upon the railroads. But that's not really a problem. Railroads are superior to steamboats anyways. And Waco, if you've ever driven up that way from Bryan College Station or from Austin or down from Dallas, I asked you in a previous lecture to look up the Hill County Courthouse and look up the McLennan County Courthouse. You could do this at Bell County, which is Belton and Temple. You can do this elsewhere. But if you look out your car next time you drive through Waco or drive to Waco, whether you're coming up from here, going to see a friend at Baylor, or you're just passing from Dallas to Austin and you pass through Waco, look out to your east, particularly, which if you're driving south, that would be your left. As you drive south from Dallas along I-35, you will see all that black land. And just imagine, if you would, in the 1890s, and especially the 1910s and 20s, all that land through there was plowed under and plowed up for cotton. Cotton was grown all through that part of the world, and that cotton was to be loaded onto cars. I say cars, but what I mean is not cabooses. I'm drawing a blank here, but basically, boxcars. That's what it was. Boxcars and flat cars, and taken down to the port at Galveston or perhaps the port at Houston. and depends on the year, depends on where they're going. But Waco was really a major market for cotton. And so that tells you a lot about its opulence and its money, again, prior to the Great Depression wrecking those farmers out along the Brazos River and, frankly, other river valleys. Something else that will tell you about how much Waco and that general area was thought to be the next great interior city, not Dallas, not Austin, but Waco, is the fact that you have Baylor University in the city of Waco along essentially the banks of the Brazos River. Sorry for the pause. I had to check on something here in the Barndo bunker as I'm recording this. Anyways, so what we're talking about here is is Baylor at Waco. Baylor University and her sister institution, Mary Hardin Baylor. Both Mary Hardin Baylor was a women's college, and Baylor University initially was a male college. They both were situated at Independence, Texas. Independence, Texas is between essentially Bryan, College Station, and Brenham. It's on Farm to Market Road 50, and in the 19th century, Independence was a town. It wasn't a major city, never was a major city, but it was a nice town. It's noteworthy for several things. Got an old Baptist church there. Sam Houston, when he became a devout Baptist, or as much as he could become a devout Baptist to satisfy his wife Margaret, he got baptized there in a creek or it was really kind of a tank almost, but it was a creek anyhow there in Independence and so forth. But it was a town enough that it attracted two universities, and when they were created. And but by the time you get to the 1870s or 1860s, the railroads are being built in Texas, and those railroads are bypassing Independence, one on the left, one on the right, and they bypass Independence, and they're not going to go through Independence. There's not going to be a spur. There's not going to be a sideline into Independence, and so Independence is kind of left high and dry. It's not unlike a little town that if you're traveling, say, through even in East Texas or Central Texas. But think about this. If you have a bypass that goes around the downtown district and bypasses the town altogether, I think out in West Texas around Level Land and that territory through there, you see these little towns that have been bypassed by the major highway, and the little town, in a sense, starts to shrivel up and die. It's good for the travel. It's bad for the merchants. So you have these trade-offs. If the railroad bypassed your town, you shriveled up and died. And so, in essence, you could say in your notes, business goes where the traffic flows. Whether it's a railroad traffic or if it's a car traffic, it's the same principle at work. Well, and so the fathers of Baylor University and Mary Hardin Baylor, which, if my memory is correct, would have been the same board of trustees, they kicked around and said, we got to get out of Independence. We can't stay here anymore because there's no future for us here. Now, obviously, there was a university about to be started there on the banks of the Brazos, and they maybe could have worked out some sort of arrangement. But that's, of course, being Texas A&M, or what was then the A&M Agricultural and Mechanical College of Texas. But all that to say is that Baylor moves, and so does Mary Hardin Baylor. And so they move the universities, or the colleges. They move one to Waco, Baylor University, and they set it up there. And they move the other, Mary Hardin Baylor, to Belton, which I've got some friends of ours who have gone there, and I know people go there right now, former students of mine. And some of you may have some friends that went to Belton. But both of those towns, and especially Waco for our telling of the story, were prosperous because of all that cotton. And the thinking was that's a good place to put your college, and it's a good place to be where probably one of the next great city, or the great interior city is established. So all that to say is that if you ever wondered why Baylor University was put or is in Waco, it has to do with economic realities of cotton and what people thought Texas was going to be like going into and through the 20th century. No air conditioning, no cars, no internal combustion engine. Electricity is very embryonic when they make this decision. It's certainly not here. And in fact, in some parts of rural Texas, electricity doesn't come to homes until the 1950s. So, I mean, still a lifetime away sort of thing. So all this thinking is that things won't change all that much. It'll change, but not all that greatly because it had never changed all that much. And so you could be a reasonable sort. Of course, it doesn't work out that way, and Waco becomes Waco, or at least the 20th century version of Waco, especially after the Great Depression and that tornado. So that's when I said, talking about I hadn't talked about Waco. It is worth something there. But I will tell you a little fun story about the Waco area. I say it's fun. It was tragic, but it was also kind of noteworthy and hilarious in the sense that this was even attempted. And it has to do with railroading and the general Waco vicinity. So I guess you could say put this in your notes. It's called the Crash at Crush. The Crash at Crush in Waco. Or rather north of Waco and just west of Waco. So it was about 10, 15 miles north and west of Waco, was a demolition derby that was established in 1896. So there's your year, 1896. The man's name is George Crush. George Crush was a promoter. He was the chief, I guess you could say, advertising and promotions officer on the Katy Railroad. The technical name, or the true name of the Katy Railroad, is the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas, MKT. And so it kind of slurs off the tongue like Katy, like the woman's name or the town's name. Some of you watching this are from Katy, Texas. Basically, that's your town. That's where the town, to my recollection, gets the name from, is Katy, the Katy Railroad. Now, the Katy Railroad was always a weak sister of a railroad. It always was the third string railroad. It was always kind of the poor man's railroad. It was, as I've taken over the years to calling it, the Dodge truck or Dodge trucks of the railroading system of the late 19th and early 20th century. It always, and you say, well, why would you pick on Dodge? Because I have a Dodge. And some of you are thinking, I love my Dodge, or you might even call it today a Ram. But if you know anything about Dodge trucks, they have a reputation for having a great motor, a decent transmission, and the body falls apart around them. The front end gives out, especially if it's got a Cummins diesel in it. And not only does the front end start to give out, the interior is seemingly shabby compared to that of a Ford or a Chevy. And the fact of the matter is that just there's a reason why often over the years Ram or Dodge was about $5,000 or $10,000 less than Ford or Chevy in the last decade or two or three. But it's always kind of been the third string truck. And oh, by the way, the seats are harsh. I did have a 2004 Dodge Ram. I had a Cummins, a great motor. The body was garbage. The back seat was like a park bench. And so cracked windshields, cracked everything. So it was just kind of uncomfortable and just kind of not so good. Well, the Katy Railroad was that way. Their cars were uncomfortable, dusty, slow. The routes they had to take, because everybody else had gotten the better, more direct routes from this point to that point, were circuitous and kind of wiggled around here or there. They didn't go straight into Houston. They went around the side and came in, and so on. So the Katy Railroad it was managed okay, but it was never going to be considered nearly as good as, say, the Union Pacific at times, or the New York Central, or the Baltimore and Ohio, or B&O, or some of these other great names, great railroads from the Missouri Pacific or Southern Pacific. It was the Katy. It was, like I said, the Dodge trucks of the railroading system. But George Crush was a promoter, and he's an advertising agent, and he's the chief promotions officer for that railroad. So he's trying to figure out a way to get the profile of the Katy Railroad up, and so he hits upon this idea of a demolition derby. And our derby, it's really just a crack-up, two trains ramming into each other and smashing up. Well, the reality is that you've got some problems with that. And some of you are thinking already, this is foolish and crazy, and you know how this is going to turn, because I have talked about this kind of in the vein of destruction and weather and all that sort of stuff like that, as far as I've been trekking westward in geography across Texas. All true. So, when you're talking about railroads, especially in 1896, the trains and the engines are driven by steam engines. You know as well as I do, when we talk about steam engines, you have to know what you're doing. Steam is made by heating water to an extreme degree, turning it from water into steam, and then harnessing that steam and using it as a propulsive power. And so we're clear about this. If you do not know what you're doing by building steam engines, or when you build boilers more particularly, you have accidents and you have fatalities and such. Boilers are just like, especially if they're not built correctly and not properly sealed and the metal is flawed. They're like they're like a poor man's bomb in a sense. They go off and explode, and it's like shrapnel everywhere. So, I mean, in our history, especially in the 19th century, you will come across these boiler explosions on steamboats and steam engines and other similar type things that take the lives of a lot of men. It was not uncommon in the 19th century to have boiler explosions, especially early on in the steam engine and the railroading days. It does allow me to say this. I won't belabor the point. It's not a full formal lecture on railroading as I sometimes give, but it is fair to say that when you talk about boiler making and so forth, think of Purdue University. Drew Brees, the quarterback for the New Orleans Saints, Texan in his own right, grew up in Austin and went to Austin Westlake. Drew Brees went to Purdue University and was a boiler maker. Obviously, that's the name kind of gives it away for what they were up to. And in fact, actually, one of the things that helps produce Texas A&M University and universities like A&M. Obviously, today it's Texas A&M University, and literally, and I don't mean this as a jab at A&M or at Aggies, but the A&M in the Texas A&M University literally stands for nothing. And that was just because when they changed the name of the university in the 1960s, they wanted to move A&M beyond its core mission. They kept the core mission, but they wanted to spread A&M out beyond the idea of agricultural and mechanical. So when you talk about an A&M, the Agricultural and Mechanical College of Texas, you have those are what are called, and some of you already know this, land-grant colleges. You probably ought to write all this down. Obviously, anything I say is fair game to you. But when we talk about land-grant colleges, the land-grant college system was established by the Lincoln administration and the Congress in 1862 and refined in subsequent legislation by a fellow named Justin Morrill. Anyways, write his name down, Justin Morrill. The Morrill Act of 1862, M-O-R-R-I-L-L. Justin Morrill was a Maine senator. I think his brother was from Vermont. They were all in politics in the mid-19th century. Well, anyways, the Morrill Act was designed to produce more colleges and universities in the United States, and of course it will go on and become the great land-grant institution. It educates a whole lot of individuals. Some of your grandparents or great-grandparents first went to college because of the land-grant system. The whole goal, though, initially of the Morrill Act and the land-grant colleges, like, by the way, Texas A&M. If you see the name state in the name, that often is it often was changed over the years from say Mississippi A&M to Mississippi State University, or Oklahoma A&M to Oklahoma State University. And so you see those changes over the years. LSU is its full legal title, to my recollection. I've seen it once, and I hope I'm saying it right. But basically, it is Louisiana State University and Agricultural and Mechanical College. So LSU is a land-grant college as well. Federal government gave away a lot of money and gave away land to help seed these universities in southern and in northern states, Purdue University being a prominent name up north, for example. I'd have to check on Ohio State, but I wouldn't be surprised either if it is too. But all that to say is that, of course, traditionally black or historically black colleges would say be a Prairie View A&M in Texas. Alcorn State in Mississippi would be another example, and there's plenty of others. Florida A&M out in Florida, of course, would be another example. Well, anyways, all that to say is that we're trying to produce scientific farming, and more particularly, we're trying to produce more engineers. We need more, and I don't mean engineers who pull the throttle. Most of you watching this, and especially in my U.S. history classes, if this lecturer shows up there somehow, the fact of the matter is many of you are engineers in training. You're getting ready to be engineers, and you're going to go to Texas A&M University for engineering or something akin to engineering. The basic understanding of Morrill, the Lincoln administration, and thoughtful Americans in the mid to late 19th century was the United States needed more engineers. We needed more builders. If we're going to be the great nation we think we are, we need more. And so Morrill and the Lincoln administration are pushing for the training of more engineers. It really takes off, however, and this is to kind of chase this rabbit to a conclusion. The great flowering of the land grant and the public university system that puts a whole lot of country boys and middle class and poor people, poor Americans through a university was the GI Bill. The GI Bill, maybe even a couple of you watching this are going through college on the GI Bill or something akin to it. But after World War II, the general consensus was, how do we repay these young men and excuse me, let me get a little drink of coffee here. How do we repay these young men for their service in the World War? And the answer is, well, we can send them to college essentially free of charge or at a very reduced rate. And on top of that, those, at least for a long time, those public universities, using A&M as an example, but public universities in Texas in general, for the longest time, the tuition in the state of Texas was heavily subsidized. So going to Texas A&M University, the University of Texas, which is not land grant to my knowledge, or some of the other state universities like Tarleton or Sam or somebody else, those were all heavily subsidized, and you really didn't go into a mountain of debt to go to college. But some things have changed in the last years, and that's not the case anymore. So anyways, the great land grant colleges were born, and so there you have it. Where was I? Yeah, I was talking about the Crash at Crush. But you got to worry about, back to the Crash at Crush, if you're going to have a couple of old trains and old steam engines smash into each other, you've got to worry about an explosion or two. And of course, George Crush knows this. He's no fool, and he doesn't want to kill paying customers. He doesn't want to cause a catastrophe on his hands, but he also knows human nature, that people would like to see two trains crash into each other. Now you think about this thing, and when you think about these two trains crashing into each other, he's going to ask. Crush is going to ask his mechanics, and he basically says, "Will this hurt anybody? Will this kill anybody? If we have ourselves a demolition derby?" And I think they asked 40 or 41 mechanics there in the main shop of the Katy Railroad, and these mechanics said no. If you put two trains together and you smash them into each other, you'll be okay. You'll have wreckage and debris, of course, but you will not have an explosion. There was one old head in the train shop, in the machine shop, who said, "You are a fool, a damned fool. And if you crash those trains into each other, you're going to have a mess on your hands. You're going to have dead on your hands. You've got to get rid of them. And so you can't do this." And so Crush, of course, listens to the 40 and not the 1, and they stage the demolition. So in 1896, and memory serves it was in September, you can check the date, doesn't matter, the Katy Railroad is going to promote this far and wide for the better part of a year. They send these trains that are going to be rammed into each other. They're old trains that are going to the scrapyard anyway, so why not get them to earn some money one last time? And so they create a special town. It's called Crush, Texas. For one day and one day only, Crush, Texas existed up north and west of Waco there, kind of around where West, if you ever heard of West, Texas, West, Texas, up north of Waco, it's a town, in that general vicinity up there. And so they promoted it. They sent out flyers, sent these trains on promotional excursions all through Texas, Oklahoma, Little New Mexico, even Louisiana. Come to Crush, Texas. Buy a ticket for $10. It was cheap. Come see two trains crash together, blah, 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 blah. They even had a post office so you could send friends and family postcards from Crush, Texas, one day only, to say that you were there at the Crash at Crush. They were going to have photos. They were going to have food. They were going to have bands. And in that time period, those speakers back then were good. Unlike some of the cats who try to pass for politicians and great speakers today who couldn't, the words almost come like out of their mouth and just kind of fall out and just kind of dribble all over the floor. Or they evaporate as soon as they come out their mouth. A lot of public speakers today can't speak. And I'm not that good, but some of these other guys they just can't speak. Well, anyways, but those guys back in the 19th century, a lot of them had the gift of oratory, or if it wasn't just a gift, it was a well-honed trade that they'd picked up. And so, I mean, you've got politicians, you've got everything. It is hoopla, it is fanfare, it is a big deal. And so the time is now here for the Crash and Crush, the main event, to take place. At 5 p.m., the two trains, which had been sitting and kind of steaming off on the sides, they come together and they touch their cow catchers. The cow catcher is that kind of that great, it's about, let's see if I can get my hands, there we go, about like that. And the cow catchers basically are out in front of the train, and the idea would be to clear off any debris that you didn't see, or if the idea literally a cow gets in the way of the track, it would knock her out of the way, and you can keep going. It wouldn't kill the cow probably. Anyways, these cow catchers the trains touched like they were shaking hands, and they were two boxers ready to go, and so they back them up. Crowd has been pushed back. They determined, okay, we need to have them back about 100 feet or so and everything will be fine. So they roped off a safe zone to watch this, and people were excited. There's several thousand people, I think about 5,000 people out there that day. But there was a lot of folks out there in that field to watch this event take place. The two trains back up 1.5 miles each direction, so their distance from each other is 3 miles. And so the signal is given, and off they go. Well, obviously, you got to have a stop point, kind of we got to stop this thing. But if you know anything about trains, and if you've ever seen one stop, it takes a while for them to stop. They don't just stop like a car does. So at about a 1/2 mile or so out, maybe 3/4 of a mile out, is a sign, and this is the point of no return. If there is no signal to stop the train at that point in time, well, the engineers and the firemen jump out of the train, and it's on. There's nothing to stop them now. And so you can see all this happening. And there's a photographer who had been hired to take official photographs and, of course, sell it. He's there taking pictures, and he's got about 3 or 4 cameras set up, and you can find these pictures on the internet. These pictures show the train coming together. And the last one he took, you can see, at least I think you can see the train start to hit and come up. And I think you can start to see just a little bit of the boiler jackets exploding, or the boilers exploding, and the jackets going with it. And then right after the photographer took that picture, he caught a rivet right in the eye and put his eye out, and down he goes. These boilers explode like that one man had prophesied. And so, oh my gosh, pandemonium is everywhere, shrapnel flying everywhere. 100 people or hundreds of people are maimed. 3 people are killed. One man was standing between his wife and some other woman underneath a tree watching the event take place, and a big old piece of shrapnel caught him and turned his head into a canoe. It was horrible. It was horrible. It was called the Crash and Crush. It's one of the great tragedies in Texas history, as one might say. 3 people died, and if you're thinking what happened next, well, you may be thinking, did George Crush get fired? Yes, he did. Was he charged with any crimes? No, he wasn't. People might have been a little more forgiving back then than they are today. But the fact of the matter is that when we say George Crush, he got his job back the day after he was fired. And then you may be thinking, well, didn't somebody sue? Or maybe you were thinking, maybe did Texans not sue like they do today? That everybody today would be calling up Jim Adler, the Texas handler. Handler. Well, maybe he's that too, but the Texas Hammer. But calling up Jim Adler or some other, famous, I'll call him ambulance chaser, but some famous trial lawyer and wrongful injury and death lawyer. We got a bunch of them. You see them everywhere. Well, yeah, Texans called up lawyers, and they went and saw them, and the Katy Railroad spent the next few years in court. But most of the lawsuits against the Katy Railroad were settled out of court, which is often the case for either a cash payment or, for far more likely, 2 lifetime tickets on the Katy Railroad for wherever she went. So it would be like having something gone horribly wrong on Southwest Airlines, and you got injured because of it. And Southwest Airlines said, well, how about this? We'll give you 2 lifetime tickets to wherever we fly. No questions asked. Sold. And so most Texans, or most people who were there at that Crash at Crush, got those lifetime tickets. And so the moral of the story is this last one, actually, in a sense. Do people pay attention to crack-ups and crashes? Yeah. Those of you from major cities that are watching this, and most of you are, you know as well as I do. You've gone down this freeway at Houston, maybe the Northwest Freeway on 290 or the Gulf Freeway toward Galveston or somewhere else. Maybe it was LBJ or 75 North in Dallas, or maybe it's Mopac or something. But you saw lights and sirens at a distance, and the cars are all slowed down, and you're like, oh my gosh, we're stuck in traffic. And then you finally got to the accident, and the accident was on the other side of the road, but everybody on your side, which was not impeded at all, were slowing down and looking, trying to see if they could see any bodies or anything like that. So, I mean, that's part of the crash and crush allure from the beginning. After it was all said and done, there is no such thing as bad publicity, they say, and I don't know if I agree completely with that, but that's certainly got a kernel of truth in it. Ridership on the Katy Railroad went up for the next few years. Just what happens, I guess. But ridership on the Katy Railroad went up, and that's the rest of the story. So, the crash and crush. So we move on now, and we, let's see, where are we at? We got the crash and crush. We need to move on down the road a little bit to, I do want to tell one other story, and it has to do with being on the Brazos River area, being in East Texas, heck, being down on the coast. Before I forget this, because I do need to mention it to you. When we talk about weather disasters, sometimes weather can breed other disasters that come later, just like the horsemen of the apocalypse sort of thing. So when we talk about the horsemen here, the other one is that those of you who've been on the coast before, and I might have even alluded to it in a previous lecture, probably did, but the fact of the matter is, and it was a different class. Anyways, mosquitoes, and that's really another facet of Texas history is how do you deal with mosquitoes? Mosquitoes cause a lot of problems. In ancient times or antique times, that basically means pre-medicine, pre-modern medicine, so that basically means prior to 1901 or so. I guess you could say germ theory, that territory through there. Just so you know, understand this, is that modern medicine, as we understand it, really doesn't take off until about 1880 or so, 1890. From my reading of history, germ theory is when the modern medicine really takes off. Before that, it was oftentimes hocus pocus and it didn't even work at all, or just killed you, with a few exceptions, and I've mentioned them over the years in other classes. So in the 19th century, so kind of when we're talking about these mosquito issues here in the 18th century and so forth, I will say this, I'll save it for a full lecture next at a later date, is that one of the earlier Indian tribes, or several of them in fact, along the Texas coast were so bedeviled and so harassed by legions and legions of mosquitoes. And you know how bad they can get on the Texas coast. Some of you have been fishing down there. You know exactly what I'm talking about. The fact is that when you talk about all those mosquitoes, the Karankawa Indians and the Attakappans up around Beaumont, they figured out a way to skin out alligators and then take that alligator grease and smear it all over them, and it worked as a form of primitive deep woods off, and it worked. Well, anyways, but moving us back into the 19th and early 20th century, some of the things that would kill Texians back then, or Texans back then, that doesn't kill Texans today, nearly in the same numbers is, very few people die from tuberculosis. Arguably, the greatest killer of the 19th century is tuberculosis. It's basically, it's a lung disease, and some of you are more familiar with it than others. What happens is it's bacterial in nature, and this bacterium gets into your lungs, and you really can't do anything about it other than try to survive it as long as you can, because it is ultimately going to be fatal. And it is communicated by aerosol. It's communicated by droplets. So when you cough, you're expelling the bacterium, and it can be very contagious at times. So if you've ever had, for a job or job interview or offer, you had to get a TB test, which normally would be a little bit underneath your arms, and they test you, that's why. It goes back, it's 19th century stuff, early 20th century. But thankfully, because of antibiotics, you were able to get TB under control. But basically, if you didn't, and this is, and it killed people into the 40s and 50s. My my grandmother-in-law, who's still living in 2020, she is 95 years old. She knew people who had it, knew people who died from it. The very famous country music superstar, he was one of the first superstars, was a fellow named Jimmy Rogers, and he had it. And so what it does is it forms tubercles, hence the term tuberculosis or lunger. The tubercles around the infection in the lungs, and so you start to cough, and you cough up blood, and it's pretty gruesome. So that killed a lot of people. Something else that killed a lot of people in times gone by, and not so much now because of antibiotics, another bacterial issue, that is pneumonia. So that would be number 2. But 3, particularly for this part of the lecture, and maybe the rest of the lecture today, has to do with the fact that you're going to see not just tuberculosis as a problem, which of course it was, but mosquitoes. And in Texas, we talk about mosquitoes being a major problem, and it caused it. And you may be thinking, what about West Nile virus? That's not what we're talking about. No, West Nile virus can be bad, and I've seen and heard people around here, meaning Bryan College Station, who've had it. Some minor cases, some unknown, and then one person dies from it, or another guy is debilitated and rendered basically paralyzed from the waist down. In one case that I know of. All that to say, though, is that mosquitoes that we're interested in is malaria, yes, but especially in Texas history, the one you need to worry about is yellow fever. Now, yellow fever has some nicknames. You probably ought to write them down. It's sometimes called yellow jack, yellow knife, the cough, and the Mexicans called it vomito, vomit with an O, vomito. And it is a pretty nasty bug. And every year, I want you to be clear about this in your notes, every year in Texas and in Mexico and in Alabama and Louisiana, all along the Gulf Coast and into interior parts of those states plus others, you will see yellow fever get going and become a real problem to the public health of the country. At times, you'll see yellow fever cemeteries. At times, you'll see segregated hospitals and segregated health systems. How do you handle it? Well, with public health measures, tracing and testing. Well, at least tracing anyways, and trying to locate and quarantine. So yellow fever, it was every year. That's the first thing I want you to remember about it. It killed people every year. It made a lot of folks sick, but not every year was the worst year. Not every year was alike. I mean, just like a flu in a sense. Some years you have a very bad flu year, and then other years it's pretty light, and you skated through high school, or you skated through your freshman year in high school without getting sick, unlike, say, maybe your 8th grade year where it was pretty rough. But yellow fever, you will have some great outbreaks of yellow fever in the state. And by the way, cholera too, but let's stick with yellow fever. In the 1830s, about 1835, 36, you'll have a yellow fever outbreak. That was pretty bad. One of the, what was his name? It's not Benjamin Rush. It was Ashbel Smith. Write that name down. Ashbel Smith. He was an early Texas physician, early Texas doctor. Ashbel, A-S-H-B-E-L, and Smith. That's easy, common spelling. Ashbel Smith was an early Texas physician, and he had to deal with a lot of different patients, some of whom had tuberculosis, some of whom had cholera, and in one year, about 1834-35, had a bad yellow fever outbreak. Again, that yellow fever would get going along the coast, along the real swampy parts of Texas, even getting as far up as, say, Sealy or something like that. And the thing about yellow fever is that it attacks the lungs, as it were, as well. And it's mosquito-borne, as we know. Anyways, what would happen in the real bad cases, the fatal cases, is that you'd get sick. And then you'd get better. I mean, when I say get sick, 103 fever, 104 fever, and then you'd get better and like, oh, I'm over it. But if you went and got sick again, that's when it really got bad. And that's when the term vomito would kick in. That's when the yellow vomit would show up. What you were going to start to do is you're going to start to spit and throw up. And what you're doing is the lungs are filling with blood, and it's coagulated blood plus the, sputum and the mucus in the lungs, and you start to throw up your lungs, and it's chunky. And that may be disgusting to think of, but the reason I brought Ashbel Smith up a minute ago was that when he was treating this, he would see that spew, and he would see his patients do this, and he's like, this is, and most people thought, my gosh, that is what's contagious. I can't touch that stuff. You may be disgusted by it, but that's actually not what the problem was. As you should know or start to understand in medicine, what we think causes problems initially, sometimes we learn, hopefully very quickly, and with modern medicine, you're just like, okay, that's not what spreads it, this does. Most people thought that spew or the body themselves, the diseased body helps spread the yellow fever. Smith said, no, that's not it. And so to prove it to some of his other physician friends in Texas in about 1834-35, he took some of that spew, some of that coagulated lung blood such from one of his dying or dead patients, and he ate it to show him that it wouldn't make him sick. Now, his physicians, like some of you are reaching for the perhaps the barf bag at this point. And you're thinking, oh my gosh, this is horrible. It didn't prove to this physician friends anything other than Ashbel Smith was nuts. But Smith was actually right. It was mosquitoes that spread it around. The reason it's noteworthy is because it has an impact upon history. In Texas history, I'll tell the story in more detail in a later lecture. But the Mexicans are trying in 1829 to repel one of several invasions by Spain or France. In this case, Spain, trying to repel an invasion by Spain, who was trying to take Mexico back over again. And the Mexicans were able to hold off and basically seal off the city of, let me think a second, it would have been Tampico, I believe it was, but seal off the city where the Spaniards had landed at. The Mexicans surmised, and were right, that the Spanish troops had no natural immunity to yellow fever, and they didn't. And so all these troops hemmed in together, a lot of mosquitoes in Tampico, Mexico, when the Spaniards there, and these mosquitoes start to do their work. And before it was all said and done, after a month or two, the Spaniards are dying left and right or sick on their back and they can't fight. And then the Mexicans basically shove the Spaniards back into the ocean. So that's, and against, that was just letting vomit or the vomito do its grisly work for you. So if you got sick that second time, after you recovered, you thought, and you got right back sick again, that's normally what killed you. By the way, if you survived yellow fever, you were generally given a lifetime immunity from it. You can almost basically say, kind of like smallpox, I won't get it again. It's not 100% true, but it was not 89% true or 90% true. Those people who got yellow fever received a lifetime immunity from it. So in that sense, herd immunity, I suppose, but at the same time, a very high price to pay. So here's a year for your notes. The worst year that is recorded to my knowledge in Texas history for yellow fever, and it has it really checks the growth of Texas, kills a bunch of people in strange and unusual places. It was just that bad, was 1867. 1867 is the standard year, the worst year for yellow fever. And everybody who survived it or got sick from it and survived it, and never forgot it. It affected many families, obviously along the coast. I'd referenced Sam Houston a few minutes ago for his baptism at Independence, Texas. He was already dead by 1867, but his wife, who was a good deal younger than he was, she was 20 or 30 years younger than he was. And so Margaret Houston, she succumbs to it in 1867. She was living at Huntsville at the time, and it killed her. In my own family, one of my great-great-uncles, or great-uncles, I guess it would have been, he got killed by it. And so, I mean, there was thousands and thousands of Texans dying over one summer because of the yellow fever outbreak. At Galveston, about 800 or 900 people died that summer. You write that down, also in the town of Brenham, which is the mothership of Blinn College, and where my check comes from, so it's a great city. Brenham had about 30% of its population die, and it was not a big town at that point, about 1,000 or two. So several hundred people died in Brenham that summer of 1867 because of yellow fever. Another town that's worth noting, just right down the road from Brenham, is a little crossroads known as LaGrange. LaGrange had 40% of its population die in 1867 because of the yellow fever outbreak. It was found, the reason it was so bad wasn't just because it was extraordinarily virulent and contagious, which it was, but it went so far inland. You found normally yellow fever stayed along the coast or just inside the coast. But in 1867, it was all the way up to Milliken, which is just south of College Station. It was all the way to Austin at times and San Antonio. You'll actually find yellow fever at times all the way to get out of Texas and get it into the United States, which Texas was at that point. But say Memphis, Tennessee, and New Orleans, they'd had bad cases in 67 and other years. But it is going to leave an indelible impact upon Texas history. You will see people who thought they were going to do things, they're dead by it. It changes their life and changes the trajectory of towns and villages and so forth. But when we talk about some of the great plagues upon Texas, that one comes to mind, the great 1867 yellow fever epidemic. And so the controlling of mosquitoes, as you can imagine, has saved a lot of lives. So anyways, in the next lecture, we'll continue westward and we'll head over to Austin and through the Highland Lakes and that territory through there. We'll talk about one of my favorite subjects, this is cultural or political geography now. The man's name is Lyndon Johnson. And we'll see you soon.